Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks very much to Nathan and Wayne of Obliterati Press who taken a chance on this book. I'm really grateful to them. As many of you know, it's been an ambition of mine to be a published author for a long time, and you guys have made it happen for me, so thanks very much. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book. So let me just... Chapter 1. Sooner or later, everybody comes to New York, and I was no exception. For me, it was art school that brought me over, and I left behind the brash primary colours of late 90s London, gladly and without remorse. Here I could reinvent myself, as others had before me, among the shining slabs of a city that seemed to have scale where others only had size, where history was measured in the minutes rather than the centuries, and where each of its 10 million inhabitants began their lives anew each morning when they awoke and pulled up the blinds. After college, I did everything I could to remain, winning a job and a work permit that came with it at the Bougainville Gallery in Chelsea, and spending the next few years living in a tiny apartment in Greenpoint with my girlfriend Hannah, working together at the gallery each day and growing gradually further and further apart. In early spring in 2011, things finally came to a head and I moved out, for reasons I don't really want to go into here. I left and went to stay on the couch of a former colleague in whom I'd increasingly been confiding. His name was not Jeff, but I have to give him a name, and Jeff will do as well as any other. Hannah's name wasn't really Hannah either. Jeff had two aunts who lived uptown in one of those huge late 19th century apartment blocks where wealthy families often take up a whole floor. Their apartment was enormous, sprawling, Jeff said, with an elegant roof garden looking out in a wide panorama over Central Park. But it was also ragged and unloved and slowly rotting away. His aunts only lived there 2 days a week, spending the rest of their time at their other home on Long Island. To make sure the place didn't collapse completely, they usually took in a lodger, and as luck would have it, Jeff told me they needed one right now. Since I was desperate to find somewhere to live, he would take me around to meet them, and we could see whether we hit it off. Far from being desperate to find somewhere to live, I was in fact quite enjoying my evenings in his apartment in Clinton Hill, watching reality TV with his witty and outspoken girlfriend Severin, whose parents had named her after the character in the Velvet Underground song Venus in Furs. But I'm a very suggestible person, and I must admit that as Jeff and I talked about it more, I found myself drifting off into an agreeable fantasy about life in that cavernous apartment, a stone's throw from Central Park. The white whirl of the Guggenheim, visible from the living room window, MoMA, the Met, and I began to feel really quite excited about the whole idea. For the 5 days each week when the Peacock sisters would be away, I would have the whole palatial penthouse to myself, and it was pleasant to feel, even in a vague and materialistic sense, that I'd be making some progress in my life after my breakup with Hannah, which I felt had set me back a step as the rest of my friends busied themselves, getting married, getting pregnant, getting comfortably settled in for the next stage of life. So I went up there with Jeff and Severin after work the next Wednesday, Severin boasting during a subway ride that the sisters viewed her as the daughter they never had, and they introduced me to Marie and Rose Peacock. We all had a glass of California Red, and Marie and Rose took me on a quick whirl around the apartment, including the small bedroom beside the roof garden that would be mine. Then it was time for the Peacocks to leave for the theatre, and we all took the lift down to the street. As Jeff flagged them down in a cab, Marie Peacock asked me a few questions about my job, tugged thoughtfully at her coat cuffs, peered into my eyes, and abruptly proposed rent of $100 a week, a sum so minuscule for the Upper East Side she might as well have made it one peppercorn. I couldn't shake her hand fast enough. We've been looking for a lodger for a while now, she told me, as we sheltered from the spring breeze under the building's awning. A year or two off and on since the last one, put in Rose. We like to have someone we know, continued Marie. Someone we know, or a friend of a friend, said Rose. Or a friend of a nephew, said Marie, waving a gloved hand in Jeff's direction. So it often takes us a while to find the right person. The last young man painted the bedroom walls green, Rose recalled mournfully. I think we'll say no painting the walls this time, decided Marie. Is that all right, young man? Of course, I said. You can move in tomorrow if you like, added Rose, as Jeff held open the cab door. So I did.
So, Wayne of the Heart. Set in New York. Everyone probably knows you worked and lived in New York for 3 years, starting in 2015. Did the novel come from working there, or was it already something that you had in mind and moving to New York just sort of becomes the idea?
No, it's something that I've been working on for a long time, and I've been working on it for many years really before I went to New York, and in some ways it was a kind of fantasy for me about what life would be like if I ever got to live in New York. And when eventually that did happen, my wife Eleanor and I got jobs there and lived there for just over 3 years. It was a very strange feeling, but by that point I'd written a pretty good draft of it. I was still working on the ending, but it definitely felt a bit like life imitating art. And we didn't live in the same area that Nick lives in the book, the Upper East Side. We lived down in the East Village, so our lives were quite different. But I really enjoyed going up and walking those streets where the characters would walk in the book, up by Central Park. There was even a building that's sort of identified as the building where the characters would live. I even, it had been such an ambition of mine for so long that sometimes I wondered if this was really happening. And I don't know if any of you remember Red Dwarf, the TV series from the 90s, but there's an episode which was a kind of precursor to The Matrix where Lister gets trapped in this computer game called Better Than Life, and it's like a immersive VR computer game that gives him the illusion of being in his favourite film, It's a Wonderful Life, living in the town of Bedford Falls, and he loves it so much that he's sort of trapped in this computer game and doesn't remember that he has a real life outside of that. And sometimes in the first few weeks of moving to New York, I'd be walking the streets of New York thinking about all the films that I'd grown up with, Taxi Driver and Mean Streets, thinking about all the books that I loved, The Great Gatsby, Underworld, and I started to suspect, was I in Better Than Life? Was I in this simulation? Would I wake up one morning and find I was still a teenager back in Manchester, reading The Catcher in the Rye and fantasizing about living in New York? But I think it did happen.
There is photographic evidence. So I think that's probably the only time anyone will mention Red Dwarf in the Way of the Heart.
I've got a couple more references.
You can never have too many, really, can you? But everyone probably knows you already as a journalist. That's how you sort of build your reputation. But did you have a different process for writing fiction, or did you draw on your experiences of writing journalism to write the novel?
It's quite different in some ways. So I think I've always been in the news journalism world, and I think that what you're doing there, the key imperative is basically to get an idea across to the reader as clearly and as quickly as possible. So that's quite different in a way to when you're writing a book and there's a number of things that you're trying to do at once with plot and character and theme and structure. I think, certain aspects of creative non-fiction, long-form journalism that can be more similar to fiction, but the type of journalism I've always been involved with, it's not been that similar. However, I do think there have been things from my journalistic career that have really helped me. For example, sort of ear for dialogue. I remember when when I started off as a local newspaper reporter, I used to really love just trying to capture exactly the idioms that people use and the patterns of speech, and I think that really carried across to dialogue in my book.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing is that like the pace of work at work is such that when I'm working trying to write fiction, I very rarely get stuck with writer's block. I can always find a way to get from A to B and then come back to it later and improve it. But I think because of the way we work at the paper, you just have to get on with it essentially, and I think that's been quite good for me when I've been drafting and redrafting.
Yeah, that's pretty good motivation. Most fiction authors tend to procrastinate for a long time, but I suppose having to meet deadlines, so you're quite used to working at a pace. It's a good ground, I suppose. Going back to New York, it's integral to the book, isn't it? I mean, it couldn't really be set anywhere else, I don't think. Any other city in the world, I don't think the book would work quite as well. It's like a character in the book in itself. But what do you think it is about New York that draws people in so much? Everyone comes to New York. It's the first line in the book. Why is that? What is it about New York that fascinates people so much?
I mean, I think for me, it really goes back a long time to sort of my teenage years where it felt like all the authors that I loved, all the music that I liked, it all seemed to cross through New York somehow. Either these people were from New York or they wrote about New York, and I really wanted to be part of that, and I wanted to not only go there, I also wanted to be part of this amazing tradition of depicting New York. And for me, I guess what I love about it so much is the intensity of the city and the fact that it's so evident that people have, ambitious, driven people, creative people, talented people have come from all over the world and merged in this city. And then I think the look of the city is almost like a visual metaphor for this, with the skyscrapers. It's almost that people have been pushed together and the only way they can go is up. They're stuck between these two rivers, and that all really adds to the intensity of it. So for me, that's what made it so such a brilliant, such an ambition of mine to both go there and then to want to depict it.
So you wanted to be part of that tradition of depicting New York. I think it's safe to say you've done that. I mean, I've never been to New York, but reading the book, I felt like I knew the city the same way I felt like I watched Taxi Driver or some of the other great New York set films and novels. I really felt like I was there. So that's a testament to your writing.
That's great.
But were there any particular New York authors who you looked to, either who influenced you directly or who you wanted to avoid?
I think one thing that's interesting about New York is because of this melting pot aspect, I feel like some of the best writers and artists about New York are often outsiders who have come to it with fresh eyes. F. Scott Fitzgerald was from the Midwest. PJ Harvey, whose best album is all about New York, in my opinion, is from Dorset. Paul Auster, who's so associated with New York, is actually from Newark, and part of that kind of tradition of people from the outskirts of a big city going to the big city and being bowled away by it and not taking it for granted. But then there are people who've been a huge influence on me from the city itself. Don DeLillo is from the Bronx. James Baldwin from Harlem. Simon and Garfunkel are from Queens, and so Public Enemy. But I think some of the books that really I was thinking about a lot when I was writing this were not so much New York authors. I was thinking a lot about The Secret History by Donna Tartt and about Margaret Atwood, and the way that with those authors, they're obviously literary authors, they've got a lot to say, but but they also really want to write a book that's a page turner and that you really get absolutely gripped by. And I definitely that was definitely my aim in this book. Yeah.
I'd say New York's integral to the book, and it is, but there's also the Egypt influence, which is central to the story. Where does the interest in Egyptology come from? Is that an interest of yours, or is it just something for the character?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've been to an amazing exhibition at the British Museum maybe 7 or 8 years ago called The Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. And it was about what the ancient Egyptians believed happens to you when you die, and it's very similar to the Christian idea of St. Peter being at the Golden Gate, telling you whether you've sinned and you can't come into heaven, or you've behaved well and you can. So they essentially had the same idea, but it was kind of wrapped in this very ornate mythology. So they had this ceremony, which is called the weighing of the heart, which I took for the title of the book, where there's a weighing scale, and your heart, which the ancient Egyptians believed was was your conscience and your mind. They didn't think the brain was your mind; they thought it was in your heart. That was weighing on one side of the scales, and on the other side was a feather. And the idea was that if the heart and the feather were in perfect balance, you got to go to heaven, which they called the field of reeds. But if the heart was too heavy, you got eaten by a horrific monster called the Devourer, who had the head of a crocodile and the body of a lion and the legs of a hippopotamus. So it was like 3 of the most fearsome animals that ancient Egyptians could ever encounter in one. And I just love this because it was at once sort of familiar in its overall idea of kind of weighing your morality before deciding whether you could get into heaven or not. And then the details were so unfamiliar, found it really beguiling. And there were other things that I thought were brilliant about it. So the heart could actually grass you up, and it was a real fear of people that when they got there, the heart would start speaking up against them on the weighing scales and say like, oh, actually, you did steal that sandwich one day. And then suddenly Anubis, who's a dog-headed fellow there, he would, he'd flip out and you'd be fed to the devourer. So one thing you could do to stop this happening was you could hold in your hand a little jade scarab, and that would protect you from your heart speaking up against you. And so in the book, the lead characters, I had them steal a painting that depicts this scene, the weighing of the heart, and it was one of those ideas where once you've come up with it, you just sort of can't believe that you were trying to write the book without this idea, because it fits so perfectly. The narrator, I think the reader should be trying to weigh up how much they trust the narrator, what they think of him. It all is perfectly symbolised in this weighing of the heart scene. And then without giving it away, I hope that I've used this imagery in an effective way towards the end of the book so that it all comes together quite well. And there was one other really interesting thing, which was that I'd kind of identified this scarab that I wanted the lead character, Nick, I wanted him to remember that when he was a teenager, he went to the British Museum and he saw this scarab, that it sort of mysteriously disappears, and you're supposed to be unclear as a reader whether he took it or not. So I looked up on the British Museum website and I tried to identify a scarab that would fit the bill, and I found one. And then I went to the British Museum to go and see it, and all that was there in the case was just a sign that said "Heart Scarab Lost." Yeah, and it was gone, and yeah, I emailed them about it, but didn't manage to find it.
You've used those elements, the Egypt elements, the New York influence, to make a pretty stunning debut novel. So people are going to be wondering what you're doing next, what you've got planned next. I certainly want to know. Have you got anything in the works or anything in mind?
Yeah, I've been working on a new book, and it's all about this theme that seems to be so prevalent today of fake news and conspiracy theories, and I've sort of gone back to what I consider to be one of the first major conspiracy theories of recent times, the moon landings, and it's going to be set in New York again. The lead character is going to be a 1970s hard-bitten journalist at the New York Daily News, and he interviews a moon landing conspiracist, and it's all completely new to him, this idea that some people might not believe that we went to the moon. But as he gets deeper and deeper into this world and meets a sort of variety of increasingly outlandish characters. So that's the basic idea of what I'm working on.
Sounds interesting. Look forward to reading it, hopefully. Just to finish off, one more light-hearted question I'd like to ask all our authors. If you could go back in time and murder any author before they become famous, and steal all their ideas, come back to now and pass them off as your own, who would it be and why?
With this, there's always a risk of unintended consequences, isn't there? Like in Back to the Future 2, you might get back to your own time. You've murdered George Orwell, but then you find that Biff Tannen is like ruling your town, and it's completely gone to pot. So Steinbeck, yeah. So I probably wouldn't murder anybody, but one person that I would try and influence a bit is. As I said, I was really influenced by Donna Tartt in this book, and when I first sort of mapped out the plot, I was going to work one day and suddenly it was announced that Donna Tartt had a new book coming out and that it was all about an art theft in New York. And I remember thinking, oh God, I really hope this doesn't get in the way of my book somehow. And it was the Goldfinch. And then a few years later, I was first sending out the first draft of this book to agents, and The Goldfinch had just come out, and it was this monster hit. Everyone was reading it, you saw it everywhere, and all the agents would just come back saying, I really like this, but it's a bit too similar to The Goldfinch. Why don't you wait a couple of years and then send it out again? So I think if I had that time travel power that you've given me, what I would just try and do is slow down Donna Tartt a bit. Like, I could put some super glue under her typewriter keys, or leave a note on her desk pretending to be her publisher saying that instead of 900 pages, why don't you make this book 1,800 pages, and it's going to be a much bigger hit. Just to slow her down enough so that The Weighing of the Heart could come out, and then I'm quite happy for The Goldfinch to come out next year or the year after that. That's absolutely fine.
The amount of authors who not having them on someone having stolen an idea from them. I'm sure Chuck Palahniuk stole Choke from me. Okay, that's all the questions I've got. Does anyone else got any questions? Do you want to ask once?
Oh, is it absolutely guaranteed that neither your mum or me appear in this book?
Yes, absolutely in this one.
Anyone else? Take the mic, rock the mic.
I will rock the mic. So, there's a really sexist question that gets asked all the time to female authors, any female person of any importance in the Daily Mail. It's so unfair that men don't get their chance to respond. So, Paul, what is your beauty secret?
Well, there's some advice my sister gave me at university: party all day, sleep all night. I think it's probably that. Rachel.
Give me bad.
Can I ask a question? You've written it in first person. I find it really difficult when I'm teaching English. Students find it really difficult to analyse the effects of writing in first person versus third person or omniscient narrator. What was it that made you choose to write it in first person and not something else?
I think I might at one stage have drafted some of it in the third person, but I think that once I'd established that I wanted the idea of something of an unreliable narrator, that seemed much more suited to the first person. So I guess it was the effects that I was trying to achieve with the reader were easier to do with first person.
It's both limiting and liberating at the same time, like in the first person. It shuts off some possibilities, but
Yeah.
also opens up little ones.
Yeah.
The peacocks. I'm a big fan of the peacocks. But what was the inspiration for those?
I think all characters are drawn from some elements of people that you know, or some aspects of yourself. With the peacocks, I can't actually remember what I was thinking there.
Why didn't you thank me in the book?
This is the one, is it?
It's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah.
I apologise for not thanking Alan and Fiona, and I'm really mortified about it. And if there's ever a second printing, perhaps which would be a good reason to buy some of the copies in the first printing.
So I am second printing.
He was mortified, by the way.
I've not read many novels where there's an unreliable narrator.
Mhm.
Where did you get that idea from? Who was your inspiration for
I think the best example of an unreliable narrator, in my opinion, is in The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I think that he just pulls that off so brilliantly. Again, it's in the first person. You get to the point towards the end of that book where whatever the narrator is saying is completely different to what the reader is meant to take from those statements. And yeah, I would really recommend that to anybody. It's an amazing book.
Anyone else?
How much of your first draft of the book was in the final book, and did you always write it to be published, or did you write it for yourself? What were your sort of motivations around starting the book all those years ago?
I've always wanted to be published, definitely, and I think one of the things that was quite frustrating after that experience where a lot of the agents were mentioning the Goldfinch was feeling that I'd finished a pretty good draft of this book and it was just sort of sitting in my metaphorical desk drawer, and I thought it was good and was just going nowhere. And one thing I'd say about that is you're always told as a prospective author that you have to have an agent to find a publisher, and I think that's probably true for the big publishers, but I just started sending it out myself without an agent to small publishers, and luckily got a brilliant one. So I would really recommend anybody does that rather than just have the book gathering dust at home. In terms of the draft, some parts of the draft are very similar to the original, but the ending really took a lot of work, and I probably went through 5 or 6 drafts and had the help of a brilliant editor, Ben Evans, there, and it's really, I think finishing a book in a satisfying way where you feel that you have achieved everything you want, that you've taken the reader to the place you want them to be, it's so hard, or I found it really hard anyway. So that, I'd say the last third of the book went through significant rewrites over the years.
Right. It won't stretch that far. It won't stretch that far, sorry about that.
Okay, can I ask
Tudor, stand up. Tudor, stand up. Come on.
Yeah, stand up. When this is filmed, who would you like to see playing the part of the central character?
Good
And I'm
question.
By the way.
Julia, I understand so much more about Paul now, thank you.
I sort of think of sort of
Yeah.
Jason Statham type.
Halfway there, halfway.
At least you didn't go Brad Pitt. So.
Would the film have all the different endings that you drafted?
Ooh, that's
you
a good
could
idea.
Release all the different endings.
Actually, we could do it
Yeah.
Netflix like Bandersnatch
Yeah.
style with the 5 or 6 endings, and the poor viewer could could choose which one they want. Aye.
When you were writing it, who did you imagine was the reader of the book?
I was thinking about this recently, and in some ways it's what you were asking me the other day, Izzy, like in some ways it's almost like the 18-year-old me who was reading all these brilliant books, doing A-level English literature and really being inspired and thinking, you know, oh, maybe one day I could write a book that people would care about as much as I care about these books. And I think I hadn't thought about it properly in those terms, but when you were asking me about that, Izzy, it's I think that's part of who I'm imagining the book might be for.
Can you send my school some free copies?
Sure. Hi.
Is there something about America that inspires you in particular? Or would you ever set a further novel, a future novel in the UK? Or is it always going to be American?
I've written most of the book I'm working on now, this one, and a couple of sort of unpublished / unfinished ones were pretty much all set in New York. And there's definitely something about New York to me that it feels like a stage where I've got the freedom to move my characters around in the way that I want. And I think I know it well, I know it really well, but maybe I don't know it quite well enough for it to sort of stymie me and for me to feel constricted by it. So I would really like to sort of write about London, and London I feel very similar to the way I feel about New York. I think it's a really inspiring, amazing place, full of amazing creative people, full of interesting people, and I'd really like to write about it, but I wonder if I'll feel that I almost know it too well, and I won't feel the same kind of creative freedom as I've felt setting things in New York.
Why not Manchester?
I have written a bit about Manchester, which is where I come from, but I feel like I've not lived there for so long now that I wouldn't feel 100% confident to write anything particularly profound about what it's like today.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thanks very much, everyone. Got some copies left to sell, so please do come and buy one. You can't come to a book launch and not buy a book. I think that's actually a law. But for now, just say well done to Paul. A big round of applause.